Welcome to Unit 6, brand new unit. We are going to move into the interwar years after World War I, kind of the what happened to the world after the Great War and leading into World War II. So we're going to have a 4-week unit, starting with the interwar years, the rise of fascism and dictators, and into World War II. So we're going to start off today looking at the Worldwide Depression. That'll be lesson 2, and then lesson 3 is going to be the rise of fascism. So your reading is matched up right here. There are a lot of graphics in this reading, so feel free. I am not going to have you take notes, or if you're even taking notes as you're reading, to skip over the large graphics. It looks like quite a bit of reading, but there's a lot of pictures and images and things in there. So don't be worried about that. All right, let's start off with post-war Europe. So remember, after the Treaty of Versailles in World War I, that people were, every country was doing differently, right? So all of Europe was devastated. Uh, Geographically, they were devastated. Financially, they were devastated. They put everything in the war. All their factories were gone. An entire generation of males, right, for working were gone. So they weren't doing good. We had high unemployment because there was nowhere for them to work. There was inflation, which is where the value of money goes down. So it takes more money to buy something, right? Um, and people were dissatisfied with their government because they blamed their governments for their troubles. So life sucks. The Great War is over, and life is not any better. There may not be a war, but they aren't able to feed their families. They can't find jobs, and people want a change. And the current governments, which are all democracies at this point because they instituted democracies in all of these countries, are. So let's look specifically at Germany, because Germany is gonna be the worst of all of these, right? Because of what happened to them, because um, they got all the blame for the war and they had to pay all of those reparations. So the government that takes over after the Kaiser is gone will be called the Weimar Republic, based in the city where it's out of. And the Weimar Republic is going to be the one that sends representatives to the Treaty of Versailles and comes back. And remember, the Treaty of Versailles, they just got annihilated. So the Weimar Republic will really never recover from the Treaty of Versailles because people blame them for everything that happened at the Treaty of Versailles. They get the war guilt clause. So Germans don't feel that the war was necessarily their fault. They especially blame Austria-Hungary, but they will have the war guilt clause, and they will owe $33 billion in reparations, which in today's money is like 500 trillion, right? Or half a trillion, sorry, 500 billion. And they have no way of paying that, right? They spend all their money on the war. So at first they start printing money. And remember, the way that money works is paper money is backed by something, and that's why it has value, right? Otherwise, it's just paper. So in the United States, our paper money is backed by gold. So every dollar that you have is backed by a little tiny piece of gold somewhere. Now, that's not necessarily true anymore. Things have changed quite a bit, but back then we were on the gold standard. Everything was backed by gold. So think of this. If you have 100 pieces of paper and you have a piece of gold, right? Each piece of paper is worth one little tiny piece of that gold. Now, what if you have 1,000 pieces, right, of paper? Each piece of paper, each dollar is worth a little bit less because there's only so much gold, right? So if you keep printing more and more paper, it's worth less and less and less. So 100 pieces of paper might be worth this rock of gold, but now 1,000 pieces of paper are only worth this rock, and now 1,000,000 pieces, right? That's inflation. So your money is worth less and less. Now, it happens sometimes just because of what's happening in your economy, or if you're printing money with nothing else to back it up. So Germany is printing all this money to pay back their loans, and that value of that money is getting worth less and less. So if you look at that, she is wearing a dress made of money because their money is literally worth nothing. So hyperinflation is just when that goes to that extreme, right? That inflation. So if we look at an example, you don't need to write this down or anything like that. I won't quiz you on it, but just so you can realize it. So in 1918, at the end of the war, a loaf of bread cost 1 mark. 1 mark is like $1, a loaf of bread, right? By 1922, a loaf of bread costs 160 marks. Think of that, $160, right, for a loaf of bread. By 1923, this is hyperinflation. This is insane. A loaf of bread costs 200 billion marks, right? Um, so there's no way to buy anything, right? So what ends up happening is in Germany, money is just worthless, and basically everything is built on a barter system. So you're trading items and goods instead of money because money is surplus at this point. Um, so they have no savings, they have no money, and who is going to come to their rescue, right? Who is the only country right now that is financially sound? And that's the United States. And remember, the United States actually comes out of the war pretty good for a while, right? Um, they have made so much money selling items. They only really came into the end of the war, so they didn't have a huge loss of life or loss of goods. So the US creates a Dawes plan. And in the Dawes plan, they are going to loan money to Germany. Because remember, the US really believes that Germany needs to be stable. Otherwise, this will happen again. Remember Woodrow Wilson's plan not to punish Germany too much. So the US starts to bail out Germany and help to bring Germany back from the brink a little tiny bit, right? Now, this is going to be in the early 1920s, but what happens if that money goes away, right? So they're propping them up a little bit, but Germany is still unable to handle itself or stand on its own. And we have to know, right, the end of 1920s in US history, what's going to happen. So the US is doing okay during the 1920s, right? Increasing after World War II. But many of you, or World War I, excuse me, but many of you know that, see where we're at right here, early 1920s. We know we're going to have a crash coming up, right? And why does that crash happen in the United States? I'm not going to get too much into it because you'll talk about that a lot in US history. But after the war, factories, well, during the war, factories are making huge amounts of products for the war, right? Now, after the war, they continue that level of production. And in the beginning, lots of people are buying things. Like, look at these cars, right? These lovely Model Ts. How do you know which one is yours? That's a great question. Um, Everyone is buying one, right? But after year one or two, everyone has a Model T. And how often do you need to buy a new Model T, right? People are buying these radios, these crazy radios. But how often do you need to buy one? So after that first initial boom, things stop. And when factories stop producing so much, what's the first thing they're going to do? Lay off their workers. Now, those workers were buying all of those cool products with debt. Consumer debt is, and kind of buying on credit is a brand new idea during this time in history in the US. And so these workers get laid off. They owe a ton of money for their home, for their Model T, for their radio, and they have no way to pay that off. And so we've got workers that all of a sudden are dropping off and unable to afford things. At the same time, we have the stock market that is going up and going up. But the stock market, so that's the other half. So we have factories making too much and workers starting to get laid off, and the stock market boom over here. So the stock market is inflated. And what that means is kind of like that idea of inflation we talked about, right? The value of stocks was higher than what it was actually worth. And so what's happening is, and this is the way stock market works, right? It's kind of like gambling. I see a stock, I buy it, but the value of that stock is just based on what I think, not on any actual real numbers, right? Now, what else is happening is that people are seeing that the stock market has never gone down. Since the creation of the stock market, it has only gone up. So people don't know a stock market crash. We have seen many now in our history, so we know that at some point it's going to crash or it's going to go down, it's going to bottom out. But people in the 1920s had never seen that. They assumed the stocks could only go up. So it was an automatic return on your investment. So what people started doing was they started buying on the margins. And what that meant was you would borrow money from the banks in order to buy stocks. You would get a loan to buy stocks. That's illegal now. You're not allowed to do that because it's kind of like going to the bank and saying, "Hey, I'm going to go to Vegas to go gambling. Can I borrow $10,000 to bet on the tables?" That is not a good investment for the banks. Just like stocks, Now you're not allowed to do that because it's not a trustworthy investment. But back then they didn't know any better. So you would go in, you'd give the bank $1, you'd say, here's my dollar down. Can I have $10 to invest in stocks? And they would say yes. So not only are the banks giving out these crazy loans, people are also taking these crazy risks on the stock market because it just keeps going up. But what happens if you lose that money in the stock market? Do you have any way of paying that back to your bank? That is the big question. And here comes Black Thursday on October 24th, 1929. And then October 29th, 1929, this is when the stock market sees its first dip and then its ultimate crash. And all those people that had borrowed money to bet on the stock market, it is all gone. So by the end of October, look at where we're at, the 29th, so by the 31st, over $30 billion has been lost on the stock market. And that money just dissolves, right? It just goes away because it wasn't truly invested in any actual product, right? So all of that money is gone. Those people cannot pay back their money to the banks. The banks now don't have enough money. And when people start going to the bank to ask for their money, they're not going to have the savings because they have been loaning it out because we had no regulations on banks. So at the same time that all these people are borrowing money to invest in the stock market, I had my savings in a bank, but the bank had no regulations, which means in order for the bank to make money, they would take my savings that I had there and they would loan it to the people that were investing in the stock market. So when they can't pay that money back, my savings is gone. And this leads to a ton of bank closures all across the United States as well. So what does this mean for Europe? That Dawes plan where we were loaning Germany billions of dollars, it is gone, right? So when the stock market crashes and doesn't recover, we no longer are able to support Europe, and Europe goes back to a bad place. So think of this. If you are a citizen in a country and you have a democracy, and you haven't had it for very long, like the Weimar Republic, and all they've done is mess up, and your life sucks, right? You are going to start looking at alternative governments that offer you solutions. Now, in the United States, that's never really a valid concern because we have always been a democracy, our ups and downs, so that is what our system is. We've never had any serious threats to that. But in countries where democracy was new, they blamed that democracy for their problems. So we are going to look at some alternatives. And one I didn't put up here was militarism, but we'll look at that in Japan. Some alternatives, and this is moving into our next chapter, to democracies that will provide stability for these countries that are struggling so much. And while they won't be great in the long term, and we look at them, we're like, oh my gosh, how could you ever live under those circumstances? Think of how terrible life was for these people and how this offered them a solution. Now, these are two different ends of the spectrum. Socialism is going to be on one end, fascism and totalitarianism will be on the other. So we'll start with socialism. Now, you don't necessarily have to write these definitions down or anything like that. This isn't covered in the book. This is kind of a review from the Russian Revolution and World War I, but I want us to see the different options. So socialism turns into communism. Socialism can never truly work in a big scale because in socialism, everything in the economy is owned by everyone collectively. So there's really there's no leadership. There's no person in charge that distributes or make decisions. So it can work on a small scale, like in a commune, possibly. But in a large scale, there's no one in charge, right? And we always actually need someone in charge. That brings us to communism. And in communism, it's the same idea where everything is collectively owned. So the people own all the factories and everything is evenly distributed. But there is a government or a person in charge, like Stalin, that makes those decisions. So Stalin is one that says, okay, all of you guys are going to work on farms. All of you guys are going to work in the factories. Then we're going to take all the milk and all the eggs from the farms and all the socks and shoes from the factories, and we'll distribute them. So there's someone in charge making those decisions, but everything is owned by the collective, right? And run by the government. So there's no private property. Everything is owned by everyone. So think of that. If you are, someone that has lost your house, that you have no money, no job, the idea of everyone getting equal pay or equal amounts of things sounds pretty darn good. All right, so that brings us to authoritarianism. Now, the thing with these is they often overlap, right? So in communism with Stalin, he was also an authoritarian. He was also a totalitarian. So these often overlap. They just have slightly different rules. Like socialism and communism have the same general idea. So in authoritarianism, we have a very strong central government that is going to kind of get rid of all individual rights. So no voting, no freedom of speech, no private practices, no private companies. The government has a say in everything. So Stalin was an authoritarian, right? There was no voting, there was no freedom of speech, no speaking out. In totalitarianism, the government takes total control. We're going to see this first with Mussolini in Italy, where the state controls every aspect. So typically the state is tied to religion. So in Italy, that'll be tied. The Pope and Mussolini will make a deal. So he is kind of in charge of the church, which is pretty crazy. Education, you're going to have indoctrination, like with the Nazis in Germany, where you go to school and you're taught the Nazi beliefs. So everything is controlled by the government. Now, why would you want that? Think of this again. If you are in a situation where you don't have any money, you don't have any food, and you blame democracy for that, while this might seem scary, it offers a sense of security. You know who's in charge, he tells you what to do, you go to work every day, you get fed um, that would offer some pretty big perks. So that brings us last to fascism. Now, fascism is often tied, or is always tied, to an extreme form of nationalism or pride in one's nation and usually one's ethnicity. So we can look at Mussolini there on the left. Italian nationalism became a form of fascism, and then really strongly with the Nazis in Germany, kind of that Aryan race, which Aryan doesn't even mean what he said it meant, but getting rid of all other ethnicities in Germany and kind of that extreme form of pride in your ethnicity and in your nation, which is linked to your language and your ethnicity, not just your borders, right? So individual rights are gone, but it's in protection of that nation, right? And this is always surrounded by a dictator. We'll see this. So let's look at some examples. And I'm going to move through these pretty quickly. We've talked about several of these. Some of these aren't going to, like Spain. It's important to know why they're not involved, but they're not involved in the war, so we're not going to talk too much about them. You'll notice all of these start to happen either during World War I or after World War I. So let's look at Mussolini first. And again, I'm covering the basic information that's in the book, so focus on one, focus on the other. It's totally up to you. So Italy, during World War I and then after World War I, very similar to Germany, is plagued by poverty, unemployment, and social unrest. So in 1919, Mussolini, who had been a journalist and a sharpshooter in World War I, comes back totally disillusioned, and he forms the fascist party known as the Black Shirts. Now we'll have the brown shirts in Germany, very different, right? But they are known as the Black Shirts because they wear black shirts as kind of their uniform. By 1922, notice this is like 10 years before Hitler will rise in Germany, the Black Shirts and Mussolini will march on Rome. Now, he is going to go to the prime minister and to the king and say, hey, I want to be in charge. And they are going to look at him and go, you're crazy. You and what army? And he's going to point out to the Black Shirts outside, gathered with weapons, and say, that army. So he is going to be appointed by the king as prime minister. So the king is kind of like, okay, either I make you prime minister or something in charge, or you're probably going to kill me and take over anyways. So the king is going to be able, he's not going to have any power, but he's going to be able to stay in charge, or he's going to be able to stay in his palace. He's going to be able to maintain his title of king. But Mussolini will truly take over. So in fascist Italy, right, we have nationalism, that Italian pride. He actually wants to bring things back to the glory of the Romans. So he's going to try and reclaim that Roman Empire. And he has to do that by expanding, right, which is reclaiming that space that the Romans had once held. Now, He is also opposed to communism, right? Because communism is the opposite, right? In nationalism and totalitarianism, he has total control, just one person in charge of everything, making all the decisions. In communism, everyone is equal. So they are exact opposites. Now we know that in Soviet communism, everyone isn't equal, but that's the idea, right? So in 1925, he declares himself dictator. In 1929, remember that piece in totalitarianism about making that deal, right, with the church? He makes a deal with the Pope to have control as long as the Pope can maintain his little enclave, right, at the Vatican. So before Hitler has even risen to power, Mussolini has taken total control in Italy. And Hitler will kind of look at him as an example of how to take control of your country and make it powerful again. Now, in 1935, trying to bring back that Roman Empire, Italy invades Ethiopia. They choose Ethiopia on purpose, thinking that it'll be an easy victory. Um, and they take control of part of Ethiopia. In 1935, this is after Hitler has started to rise, but no one else has really realized what's going on. Mussolini will make a deal with Hitler. We'll have the Rome-Berlin axis, which will be formed. We'll actually see this kind of come to being in the Spanish Civil War when they both kind of work together to help Franco win the Spanish Civil War. All right, so let's look at the Soviet Union. Again, I'm going to speed through this because we just talked about this with the Russian Revolution. In 1917, we have the Russian Revolution. 1922, they officially become the USSR, right? And that is all of the Soviets. Remember, the Soviets are those pockets of leadership in one nation, so they don't really consider themselves one nation. They're more a combination of all of these Soviets. 1924, Lenin dies and Stalin takes over. So Stalin replaces Lenin. You don't need to know all these years. I'm just trying to show you a timeline. He begins the Great Purge, where he starts to get rid of all of his opposition in government and sends them to gulags. You can see that down there. Gulags are actually where Hitler will get his idea for concentration camps. In 1939, so a couple years after the Italian-German alliance, he will sign a non-aggression pact with Germany, and they will agree that they are going to both move into Poland, split Poland in half, take pieces of Poland, and then leave each other alone. Now, should you ever trust Hitler? No, neither should the Soviets. They shouldn't have trusted Hitler either, but we'll see that next week. Let's skip that 5-year plan. All right, so to Spain. So in Spain, we have a civil war that erupts in 1936. This is towards the start, right, of World War II. Things are starting to get rolling. But Francisco Franco, who is a military official, will lead a rebellion in Spain. So it will be Franco's nationalists who are on the far right against the Republicans who are on the far left. Now, you can probably guess the Republicans were more communist in their beliefs. So this is going to be a proxy war where both sides are funded and supported by other countries. So Franco will be supported by Germany and the Italians, who also have strong one-man rule, right? And the Republicans will be backed by the Soviets. Now, Franco, it is brutal. And by 1939, Franco and the nationalists will march into Madrid, the capital, as winners. Over 1 million people have died, all Spanish, right? They killed each other. It's a civil war. And this is kind of the beginning of that Germany-Italian alliance. Now, Franco is so involved with getting control of his country that he doesn't get involved in World War II at all, really. He will send some volunteers who want to go, but he does not join in any way, shape, or form. By the way, if you ever want to see a great movie, Pan's Labyrinth, based around it's kind of a sci-fi movie, but it is one of the only movies I've seen that really talks about the Spanish Civil War in any way. All right, to Japan. So in 1929, just like the rest of the world, Japan experiences the Great Depression. The only problem is Japan is an island and they don't have many resources. So they cannot, plant their own things to feed themselves. They need to, and Hideki Tojo, who is going to become the prime minister, but is right now at this point just a military leader, believes that expansion is the only way to keep Japan alive and thriving and to bring it to its glory that it should have. And he believes that's going to happen through militarism and colonization, right? You need colonies to supply the superior Japanese race. And he looks at the United States expanding and as an example, right? So in 1931, Japan moves into Manchuria, which is a little section of China. They'll stay there for quite a bit, but a couple years later, they're going to start to expand and try and move into mainland China. Now, they don't want all of China, right? Especially northern China. They don't feel like there are any resources there. But if you look at this dark area of China that they take, that Manchuria is a really strong area for agriculture and food, right? So they're also going to want to move. You can see they're not worried about mainland China, but they are going to move along the coast, and you can see these different spots they take over. So they're going to move along Formosa, which will become Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. They're going to move that direction into Vietnam as well. They will actually take control of Vietnam for a while, which is going to lead to some drama and the Vietnam War with the United States later on. So 1936, Japan will move into mainland China, and we're going to have one of the worst incidents in these early years of the war, which is called the Rape of Nanjing or the Rape of Nanking in 1937, when Japanese soldiers go into Nanking and kill everyone. So the entire population, men, women, children, didn't matter. You can look, the right is a painting of this time period, but the left is a picture, and those are all heads laying on there. They did not treat the people well, obviously, since they killed them all, but they also did some terrible things to the bodies afterwards. So a lot of negative, even just the situation itself is terrible, but kind of the way that it was handled also made the Japanese look worse. And if you saw that number, I went out really quickly, but over 300,000 people were killed in this one incident. Over 20,000 women were raped in the lead up to that incident. So that is why it's called the Rape of Nanking. So after Japan is starting this, the League of Nations, remember them, they actually have no military, right? They're not the United Nations yet. They look at Japan, they go, Japan, stop. And Japan goes, it's okay that the United States does this. It's okay that other countries do this, but we can't. So they get up and they walk out of the meeting and leave the League of Nations. And that is when they truly begin to try and get their own empire. Now, the United States looks at this and they go, whoa, this is bad news, right? So Great Britain is starting to get wrapped up in all of the Hitler incidents, what is happening there. So Great Britain is going to pull all of its ships out of Asia, and that will leave open places like Hong Kong, and France is having to do the same thing. So Vietnam is going to open up. So Japan has the opportunity for more expansion. The US looks at this and goes, whoa, what is happening? How can we slow down Japan? And so they place an embargo on Japan and they stop selling them oil. Now they're hoping that will get Japan to slow down and be like, okay, we'll follow your rules, start selling us oil again. Because remember, Japan doesn't have those resources, right? But what does Japan do instead? They go, oh, why don't we just go get these open colonies now that France and England are gone that have oil? So instead of slowing down Japan, the US placing an embargo actually speeds up Japan's colonization and expansion and forces them to join up with the opposite side. So in 1940, Japan joins a tripartite pact with Italy and with Germany and Hitler, and is on the opposition of our sides, right? Now they will continue negotiations with us, but if you know anything about US history, you know in 1941 those negotiations are just a distraction while they plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. So we know what happens next, and that will bring us to China and then Great Britain. Sorry, this is long, you guys. So China, we know that China is going to eventually fall to communism, but at the end of World War I, that hasn't happened yet. So on May 4th, students begin to protest against democracy. Yes, against democracy in the Treaty of Versailles, which they don't feel treated them very well. 1921, Mao Zedong will found the Communist Party, and we will have a civil war, just like we did in Spain. So we'll have the nationalists versus the communists. So the nationalists are going to be backed by the United States. The communists are going to be backed by the Soviets. Now, the nationalists are kind of going to lead the show for a while, and In 1927, we'll have the Shanghai Massacre, where nationalists will mass execute all of the communists that they can find. Mao, the leader of the communists, will go into hiding, and he will begin the Long March, which is down there at the bottom. So I'm kind of skipping some things. So the Long March is when Mao is going to walk 6,000 supposedly miles to freedom, basically. And along the way, he will recruit peasants to his cause, and will also begin the process of guerrilla warfare because they have so few numbers and are not backed by as wealthy nations as the nationalists are. So what's going to happen is as he marches, he is going to gather the entire country behind him. And what do you think is going to happen after that? So here is him on his long march, right? Gathering the peasants. Everyone is happy. March is happening. And sorry. What's happening at the same time, he is on his long march. Japan's starting to invade. World War II is happening. What happens to China's Civil War? Well, between 1936 and 1945, and these are the two leaders here at the top, Mao's on the right, Czech is on the left, they basically have a truce. They're like, we have to defend ourselves against Japan. We need to put aside our petty differences, right? So until the end of World War II, they have a truce. They're like, deal, we'll make this work, which is crazy, right? Because they just like were killing each other. So in 1945, after, just to give you like a preview of what's going to happen afterwards, the Civil War starts right back up, right? After they had this truce and kind of fended off the Japanese. And it starts, the US will support, of course, the nationalists against the communists, and it does not turn out well for the nationalists. So here is our last little piece here. What's going on with Great Britain this whole time, right? After World War I, Great Britain will also go into a Great Depression, right? But as we'll see here in the next couple of slides, how Great Britain will try and get out of that Great Depression is very similar to what the US does under FDR. They will do public works. So they will shrink the size of their military, which will hurt them going into World War II, and take that money and put it towards getting people back to work, building bridges and that kind of thing, just like the US does. Now, in 1936, King George V, who had led the country through World War I, beloved by all his people, dies, and Edward VIII, his oldest son, will take over. Now, the problem is, Edward VIII, there's a lot of drama. I'm not going to get too into this. If you've ever watched, what is it? It's not The Crown. It does talk about it in the beginning of The Crown, but there are some great shows about this. There's also one called The King's Speech that is very good. Edward is kind of a playboy, and he actually falls in love with at the time she was married, but she'd been divorced before, American. And if you know anything about British royalty, if you are a royal, you cannot be married to someone that has been divorced. That was a big deal with Meghan Markle, right? And the whole drama with her marrying Prince Harry. But Edward decides, screw this. I'd rather marry her than be king. And he abdicates or gives up the throne, marries her, they go and live off in exile, and were married until they died. Like, they apparently had a lovely marriage. But who's going to take over is his younger brother, George VI. And George VI is known for his stutter. And that's why I'm saying watch The King's Speech. It's rated R because they swear a lot, but man, it's a good movie. And he has a terrible stutter, and now he has to lead this country, and he can't even speak on the radio. He can't give public performances. He stutters terribly. And because of that stutter, he is very insecure and very nervous, but he also is very, very smart. So very cool story about how he overcomes his stutter and will lead his people through World War II, and it's just amazing. Now, if you look at that picture, the oldest daughter right there, that's Elizabeth, who is currently Queen of England right now. So that's her as a little girl. So a couple things that they will do leading up to the war. One of them will be Kindertransport, which is pretty cool. As they start to find out what is happening in Germany to the Jewish population, they will start to begin these boat transfers of little kids, little Jewish children, to England, and they will be matched up with families through the duration of the war. And what's going to happen. So, remember that the king or queen, while they do have some power in Great Britain, most of the power lies with Parliament and the Prime Minister. So going into the war, we have Neville Chamberlain. He's the guy on the right there, the skinnier guy, who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And in 1938, he will sign the Munich Pact, which is going to be really, really bad in hindsight. So the Munich Pact is a policy of appeasement. And he basically says, okay, Hitler, you can have this little area as long as you stop invading anymore. And he thinks it works. He comes home and he's like, yay, we have peace now. Shortly after, Hitler continues and Chamberlain is out. In September of 1939, Britain will officially declare war on Germany when Germany invades Poland, kind of breaking their, this is the last thing. If you invade Poland, we're going to have to declare war. And so they do. Just some terms to know, you have the Royal Air Force and the British Expeditionary. So that brings us to our last group, and that is going to be Germany. So what happens in Germany? How does Hitler rise so quickly? So after World War I, remember Hitler was in the war. At the end of the war, he was damaged by gas damage. He was injured by poison gas, and so he isn't really active when the end of the war happens. But when the war ends, he is angry. Now he stays in the army, but the army is all disbanded, right? So there's not really a lot of jobs for him. So he's sent as a spy to start to spy on these little rising groups throughout the country that may or may not, right, be like terrorist groups. So he is sent to spy on the German Workers' Party. Now, when he is there, he listens to them and he realizes that this is what he actually believes in, right? That these workers are right. And he gets more and more involved. He actually quits the army officially and just devotes all of his time to this party, which will change its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which will be known as the Nazis. As he rises to power, we'll see that he takes on the name Fuhrer. He introduces the Heil Hitler, the Nazi salute. We see the Nazi flag and the swastika, which is something that he had kind of put together. Remember, he was an artist, right? So these are all things coming from him. So remember how Mussolini had his march on Rome. So based off of that, Hitler will try and have a march on Munich. Now, it is very unsuccessful. Everyone involved is arrested, several are killed. He is arrested and sent to prison, right, for this, but it is in prison that he writes Mein Kampf, which is kind of his, this is how the Nazi party will work. This is what Germany should look like. His prison cell, when he was put on trial, the judge was actually kind of sympathetic to his goals, right? To like, well, you just want a better Germany. You're just trying to make us better. So the prison that he's put in, he's in his own room. He has his own stuff. It's not really the end of the world. He was sentenced to 5. He serves less than 1. And we know that Germany is having this Great Depression. When Hitler comes out and sees what happens to the economy, that's when the Nazis really step in, right? Because they are offering an alternative to the Weimar Republic. And Hitler does things like pretty smart. Instead of just trying to do this massive takeover because he knows he won't be able to do that, the Nazi party just gets elected to office all throughout the country, right? They keep getting elected to all these different positions in government. And by 1932, they hold the majority of seats in the German parliament and in all these little places, right? They're the largest political party in Germany. Now, in 1932, Hitler decides to run for president because they are the largest political party. Now, he doesn't win. He's beat by Hindenburg, but he has such a strong showing that he is named chancellor, kind of like vice president, right? Like, what do you do with the guy you're kind of worried about, but you don't want to give him much power? You name him vice president. You name him chancellor. Now, in March of 1933, the Reichstag, which is the German parliament building, is destroyed, right? They believe it's arson. Hitler, in a move to get rid of his blames the communists, who are his competition, and he gets a law passed to ban all communists from Germany. And this is when we first see, they're not called this yet, they're called labor camps and work camps, but he sends all the communists to these camps that will eventually evolve into concentration camps. On June 30th of 1934, we have the Night of the Long Knives, when the SS, who is Hitler's new secret army, replacing the SA, will go out using knives and guns and kill all of Hitler's opposition. So now the communists are gone, his opposition within his own party are gone, and now Hitler has true control of the German government. So the only thing that's left to get rid of is Hindenburg, the president himself. Hindenburg dies of natural causes. No one becomes president. Hitler just takes over. And he begins this, just like in the New Deal in the US and the public works in Great Britain, Hitler begins to put people back to work on public works, right? Now, some of these are going to be huge public works that we still know about today, right? The Autobahn, right? The freeway system, Volkswagen. The Volkswagen bug is created in Germany, not by Hitler, but by his group to mass produce a cheap car. So that will come about during this time. Now, unemployment will go down from 6 million to 1.5 million by 1936. That is insane. And Hitler is truly in control. Now, remember that whole totalitarian thing, right? Not only does he basically get rid of religion, he takes control of the government, of the economy, and of the schools with Hitler's youth and the League of German Girls. And there he is.